Critical Thinking. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and we're going to finish up talking about thinking critically about religion and move right into a discussion of thinking critically about ethics. Just a couple of brief announcements. Extra credit exam closed. Let's see. The drop deadline, the grade option and drop deadline is always Friday of week 8, 5 p.m. So make sure you've decided whether you want to go with letter grade or pass, no pass. You can still bail in the class. You have until Friday at 5 to just completely walk away with a little. You'll have a little W next to the class in your transcript. So, but make sure you make all the decisions for this class and all your other classes by Friday at 5. The extra credit exam is open through Friday of week 10. So you have till then to take it. If you're thinking about the grade option thing, you might want to take it tomorrow if you feel ready for it. So,
and what's it going to be on? The first?
Still be on the material from the first and second midterm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so none of the stuff on religion. So all the stuff on deductive fallacies and inductive fallacies. Basically, let's see, we did stuff about like what is critical thinking, and then formal logic, and then we did a thing on informal logic, and that will be what it covers. So the weeks 1 through 6. And so this stuff is all going to be on the final. The stuff about religion and ethics, and we'll talk about the news and politics next week. And I'll see what else I have room for. I'm having to chop out things because of my absences, so I hope you made productive use of your day off. If anything else, just like to catch up in your other classes or just rest. It gets kind of hectic near the end of the term here. So I don't expect to have any more absences. Fingers crossed. Okay, so let's talk about religion just to refresh our minds. So we just hit like a common thing you hear about religion. Okay, how about the green again? Fix this. There we go. Oops. You ever hear anybody say this? There are many roads to God. Well, and what do people mean when they say this generally?
That there are many ways to self-improve to the ideal?
I would say no. Now that might be what you mean by it, but see, I think you take kind of like a liberal approach to religion, where you see it as sort of like a metaphor for something, whereas like most people who are religious believe in their own religion. Right? They believe it. It's not just about self. It's about God. It's about the supernatural. It's about spirits and demons. It's about sometimes it's about the spirit of your ancestors. Sometimes it's about avatars of the ultimate reality or whatever. Right? So there are lots of, and it's about sin and salvation. It's about enlightenment. It's about detachment from the material world. It's about communing with supernatural forces through altered states of consciousness. That's all part of religion. Now, it's generally speaking, people see the self-improvement, and we'll talk about ethics next, maybe let's say in a half hour. We'll get to ethics, and so ethics is generally, I'd say ethics is a part of every religion, but it's sort of, it's derived from the metaphysics. So I know you like Nietzsche. So Nietzsche talks about how like you have this Christian metaphysics, and then it generates a certain set of ethics. So Jesus, died on the cross for our sins. He's like the sinless sacrifice, and it's sort of this altruistic teaching that we need to die to ourselves. We need to serve other people. We need to serve God, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And Nietzsche says, well, look, nobody believes in God anymore. And, in Germany in the 19th century, God was definitely on his way out, and big swatches of Europe. I think Europe now is about like Germany, maybe a third of people say they're atheists. I think in France, maybe it's a quarter. People that do believe in God, it's sort of an abstraction. It's not a general, like, everyday part of their life. They see Americans as being kind of nutty in this regard. Yeah?
I always hear the number that 95% of people in the world believe in God. Is that accurate at all? I kind of feel like it is.
I think that's true just because of the sheer numbers of people in different countries where, like in the very populous third world. So you look at, like, religiosity is really big in, say, Central and South America, in the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, but the United States is pretty religious compared to Western Europe. But you look at all South America, people are heavily religious. South and Central America, Asia, people are Buddhists or they're Taoists, Confucius, and usually they kind of mix and match. In India, Hinduism, people are very religious. So religiosity, and then in China, you have like the sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for, like the legacy of communism. But even that, even after that, people are highly religious, and they practice sort of the native folk religion of China along with Buddhism. So if you look sort of down, and some countries are super religious, some more than others. I think South Korea is very religious. There's a surprising number of evangelical Christians in South Korea. Europe tends to be is more secular, I think, than the rest of the world. But so if you average all those things, you have some areas where it's like 99%, and then other areas where it's maybe, I think the polls in America, it depends on how you ask the question. Only about 6% of Americans will admit to being an atheist. But if you ask people, like, whether they live like a secular life as if there is no God, and larger number of people will say they're secular, maybe 10% or something like that. But it's in other countries it's like 2%. So if it all averages out, maybe something like that, maybe 90, maybe 95 or 96. Atheists are few and far between. So if you look at this idea, there are many roads to God. What does somebody mean when they say this?
Many religions.
Well, there's lots of, there's lots of religions, and then that's like an empirical fact, right? Okay. So, what about like these many religions? Yeah.
Like you can live your life a lot of ways, and it'll lead you to God in the end.
Yeah, like each religion is valid in its own way.
The reason that number's probably so high is because people don't like the idea that it might be meaningless. So it seems counterintuitive to not believe in a God to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You ask a question like, why are some people religious and some aren't, and why is it sort of really big in some areas, and why are people like less religious in some areas? And usually you can trace it down to like cultural movements, like countries like Russia. Although Russia has a resurgence of religions, but places where religion is oppressed by the government, like Russia and China, you get people being less religious. And maybe that 98% figure is too high because there's a lot of people in China as far as the world's population. But you look at the Middle East, people are very religious, and that's because religion is supported by the state by and large. And and people who are anti-religious or speak out against religion are punished. So that's a reason maybe why people are religious there. And to some extent in South America too, it's true, like religious morality is sort of enforced by the government. Or you have countries that are sort of officially Catholic. There's some countries that are like, I don't know, like where it's sort of part of the culture, but there's others where it's actually supported by the government. And America is someplace in between, maybe. We have de facto separation of church and state, but there are a lot of religious people involved in politics. So anyway, this idea that each religion is valid in its own way. Now, when a person, when somebody says it, is this like an empirical belief, or is it something like people talk about this as like it's sort of like an a priori belief. A priori means before experience. So this means you just before even looking at it, you kind of know it's like a hypothesis, something that's discerned through like conceptualizing the issue, conceptual thinking versus like looking at the evidence, right? And people assume like a priori before they've even looked at the day of religion, oh, many roads lead to God. But I mean, what evidence is there for that idea? Like, why would you assume that's true? Maybe somebody's looked at the evidence. This is the evidence just sort of a posteriori. So the opposite of a priori is you sort of look at the evidence and try to figure things out. And you look at all the different religions, and they all say the other guys are wrong. Like this idea that every religion is right in its own way is a kind of a modernistic notion. Throughout history, most people believed in their own religion. And now, sometimes in the East, I would say, Eastern religions tend to look at things in this way, whereas Western religions tend to look at things as being more separate. But even like the Eastern religions will say that all paths are valid, but usually that's coupled with, but you know, some paths are better than others. And if you're caught up in this thing about sin and salvation and blood atonement and you're like reading the Bible literally, you're kind of like, you know, down there on the scale, like junior religionist, and you're not very spiritual, and you have kind of primitive ideas. And, you know, the more full ideas are you know, basically Eastern mystical ideas. So even people who pay lip service to this many roads to God thing tend to prioritize their own path over others. But this is like I'll call a modern, to use a religious term, a shibboleth, which is sort of like a kind of something that applied to the people's mouth, but they don't really have any reason to believe or support. Now, this may be true. It might be that God created all the religions, or man created all the religions, and each religion is sort of a stepping stone to God. But you'd have to look at each of the religions and try to figure out, you know, whether that's really true or not, whether there's reason to believe that's true. The problem is with all these religions, so you get many concepts of God, many concepts of salvation, right? So what does it mean by having a road to God? So first of all, there's this question about the destination of like what God is and what it means to reach God. Does it mean God forgives you of your sins? Does it mean God enlightens you as to the truth of all reality? Does it mean you detach yourself from this world and that's how you get to God? And then what does it mean to get to God? Does it mean reaching nirvana? Does it mean becoming one with the Brahman? There's all sorts of different concepts of like what this end result is supposed to be. Is it merging with God? Is it being in heaven with God? You know, do you have a soul or not? Like some forms of Buddhism teach you don't even have a soul. And then the question is, well, what is it that gets to heaven? And it gets kind of murky.
I would say the main salvation of like all religions would probably just be infinite existence.
Infinite existence.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean?
It means, well, because, you know, we live a finite life now, and people don't like that very much, and so they can create the idea of a God that isn't finite like us.
Mm-hmm.
And then the thought is that if we, you know, proclaim faith to that God, we'll get to experience the same thing he does, or we'll be graced with that same type of treatment. And so,
well, even the faith concept, that's like, you know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam thing. That's not really a thing in the Eastern religions. So even this idea that you should have faith isn't really like isn't a universal concept in the religions. Yeah.
I feel like it's more universal for it to be for salvation, like a better place. Like even the nirvana, like Native Americans believe that you're born again and again and again until you reach that nirvana, and then you're not born anymore here. You transcend to another place, or Christianity, it's heaven, or et cetera, et cetera.
But what would be the point of it if it wasn't infinite? or would be the motivation?
Well, that's more implied, I guess, but it's not really.
Because I
that seems to be a side issue.
Because eternal consciousness would be its own kind of hell. Like after a few 100,000 years or whatever, you'd be screaming to be let out. So maybe this is just a cycle of reincarnation. It's a game we're playing to pass the time and not go crazy. Have your memory wiped with each lifetime so you don't remember that, oh man, I'm an eternal soul. This sucks.
Okay, that's an interesting theory. I suppose then you'd have to come up with, well, what's the evidence for reincarnation? I want to stick to this question of like the eventual destination, so a better place. But I mean, except for unless you do the things that send you to the bad place, right?
Yeah.
So like I don't know if Native Americans, I don't know that there's like, I mean there's. The problem with like talking about Native American religion in general is there's lots of different tribes and they have different beliefs, and there's some commonalities, but there are also some differences. But some religions have this concept of hell, and if you do the bad things, then you go to the bad place. And all these religions differ on what the bad things are. Now, sometimes they agree on some of the things, but like sometimes, like Christianity, for example, says unless you believe Jesus, Son of God, you're going to the bad place. Other places say that don't believe in that. So, and one way of thinking of this is everyone's an atheist. Everyone's an atheist with regard to other people's religions, right? They don't believe in other people's religions. Yeah.
I was going to go off the fear thing, that most religions, I would say, have a side of fear or towards, they project fear on people to have the illusion that they need to be doing something else, I guess. Like,
now you see, like how sort of this idea
of factor in people to kind of get them to do, not manipulate, but like get them to do certain things.
So is this the sort of idea that hell is kind of this conspiratorial thing where like the priests cook it up to get people to do what they want them to or something?
Well, I mean, like, tell me if I'm wrong, but don't most world religions consider the world to have an end at some point, and then this is kind of like their eternity?
Actually, no. So it's a good example, though. So the Western religions tend to see history as being finite and having an end. The Eastern religions tend to look at the world as being cyclical and going through these big epochs of creation, destruction, and some traditions sort of lasting billions of years, and it's seen as this big cosmic cycle.
Interesting.
So it's really hard to find.
They don't have like a quote-unquote hell, I guess, and those.
Well, so they do, except for it's not sort of a permanent place.
Okay, so they can get out of it. Okay, that's what I'm saying.
You kind of work your way out. It's kind of like purgatory, I guess. So maybe it's not technically hell.
But their only way to get out of said thing is to work with the religion to get out of it, correct? So they're implementing fear on these people to get them to do certain
Well, see, that second thing, I think, that speaks to motivation and how religions are created. And like, as I said, it seems like your hypothesis is that religions is sort of a tool of social control or something. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure that's right. Religions seem to emerge organically in like all cultures, and hell might have more to do with this idea of people who do bad things shouldn't be able to get away with it, and also might have to do with internalized guilt. I mean, there's lots. If you want to psychoanalyze the motivations that sort of give rise to religious concepts, I think like the justice of God is a big one. And this idea that, the idea is that good should be rewarded and evil should be punished ultimately, otherwise this world doesn't make any sense, is a big part of it. Now, sometimes in history, people definitely use religion for political purposes and purposes of control, but I'm not sure that's necessarily what generates it, although it might be, fear might be a part of the picture, but it's, I'd say fear of death is a big motivator for people believing in like religious ideas, particularly like this idea of the afterlife, and then you get this hope that you go to a good place and not a bad place.
Would you consider guilt to be like a driver? Because like if you think about it, every bad thing that you do let's say you do have guilt, and you understand that society isn't going to treat you the same as a religion. So, I mean, if you're going to ask the state for forgiveness for some bad thing you've done, you're going to be placed in jail. You're not going to get that forgiveness. And so maybe just by the understanding of how society acts to wrongdoings, they think, well, okay, the only way that I'm going to get forgiveness is through this other worldly belief system to forgiveness.
Yeah. Maybe, I mean, people have internalized guilt and like the difference between maybe a crime where you break the law. And sometimes like God is portrayed as a sort of like a judge who, punishes you, or he might, judges could go easy on you. Like there are lenient judges.
Yeah.
And so the idea you throw yourself in the mercy of the court, maybe you get a lighter sentence. So there's that concept you see in different religions too. The main thing I wanted to put forth though is this idea that all religions teach basically the same thing is empirically false. So if each religion has a different conception of God, a different conception of the human problem, a different conception of how we overcome that problem, different concepts of salvation or enlightenment or transcendence or whatever you want to call this sort of way that you get to God, then you get a problem, right? So either you got to pick one, right? One of the religions is true, or none of them are true. They can't all be true at the same time because they could teach contrary things. And this goes back to this idea of logical consistency. And people that say these things, typically they're either ignorant of the details of what different religions teach, or they have some sort of ethic of tolerance that they're using as their principle, and then they're trying to squeeze religions into little categories and try to sort of find some way in which nobody can judge anybody else, and everybody and if that happens, then everybody can sing kumbaya and live together in peace and harmony. Yeah, it's a nice goal, right? But do you want to sacrifice like the truth and logic and critical thinking for a social goal of tolerance? I would say that's a bad idea. And it seems like you can do this too, right? You can be tolerant of someone and believe that they're wrong. Like you have the right to be wrong. And this is sort of a modern liberal idea, right? This idea that you get to pick your religion, even if it's going to send you gibbering down to hell to suffer for all eternity. It's your free choice to pick the wrong religion, to not be religious at all, and even to go out and sin it up. And as long as you're not stealing stuff from people and breaking things, you can go out and become a drunkard. You can a glutton, a sloth. You can go out and commit adultery, right? We don't jail people for adultery in liberal societies anymore. They used to put you in the stocks. I mean, it used to be like the Puritan days, right? You'd be punished for blasphemy. You'd be punished for adultery. You could be punished even for like using salty language. So it's all those things. So now, like the idea is you get to pick your own religion, and that idea is completely consistent with this idea that either all the religions are wrong or one of them is right? But they can't all be right. Maybe you get a couple of them that could be mostly right? But typically there's contradictions between the religions that are so much so that you really can't imagine them both being the true religion, and they all can't be the true religion. Comments, questions, disputations. Yeah.
It's like the whole many roads leads to God.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's almost the opposite of religion. Teach basically the same thing.
Oh, that's a good question, right? That's a good observation that if you say all religions teach basically the same thing, then there aren't many roads to God. There's just one road to God. So maybe this that's a good observation. So these are like two concepts. Like, so people either they make these two. I mean, these are like two mistakes. They'll say all religions are the same. That's not true. And they say, okay, well maybe they're different, but they all lead to the same God. But there's no reason to believe that either, right? And then the question is, usually people are willing to draw the line someplace. They'll say, okay, like Church of Satan, right? That's not a good way to do things. That the Church of Satan might lead you to Satan, and that's bad. So the devil worshippers, no. Scientology maybe, kind of iffy on that. How about like kooky cults like this? Who is this? That woman on I don't know, it was really a cult. There's a sensational story in the news about a woman who was on Smallville being part of this human potential cult. It's not really a religious cult, though. I think it's more of like kind of a cult of personality, I guess. But there are people like join these sort of self-styled cults all the time. Are you going to say like anybody who's whatever religion you have that it's all leading to God? Yeah.
Random question, kind of on topic, but what's the difference between religion and cult?
Oh, good question.
Your interpretation of that?
I would say like cults. I define cult as sort of psychologically as being an organization that rises up around a charismatic figure, uses sort of deceptive recruiting techniques, isolates the people who are members of the group, has an authoritarian kind of structure to it that squelches free thoughts. Now, some of these things you find them in religious movements, but cults are they're very controlling, and they use mind control techniques to get people to fall into line. And again, more so than like maybe things you might see in traditional churches. I mean, every group, political, religious, that you have like in-group rituals and beliefs and the people that dissent from the purity of the group are looked down on, and there are certain orthodoxies in the group that everybody's expect to follow. Like that's part of any group. But a cult sort of basically a cult will have those things in spades and just really be controlling and typically cults are created for some for the personal enrichment of a particular person. Where I would say like most religious people and clerics and so on are sincere and believe their own religion. It's not necessarily the case with the cultist. Although some cultists can be also like Jim Jones, they can be sort of scheming and calculating and also insane. I don't. Let me.
What makes them insane though? Because they have no evidence to prove that their thing exists or that they're right.
Drinking the Kool-Aid.
Because I don't know. Everything you just said to me sounded like you just. My interpretation of that sounded just like religion to me. So I don't know.
Joe Rogan kind of comically said that cults have a living founder and religions have a dead founder.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. That was just how I interpret it. When you said that to me, I think those are all certain characteristics that I find in religion. So I don't know.
Cults tend to have be small, have like a modern charismatic founder.
Right.
And be something that was started kind of as a scam, not something that grew up organically around a culture over hundreds of years. So that might be one distinction.
Just time.
This other question, whereas like this, there's the, maybe I'll just mention the skepticism. Skepticism about religion. Like, why might you be skeptical about religion? And one thing you might think of about this sort of reverence for the ancient. This is a big part of religion, this idea of revering ancient texts because they're ancient. But if you think about they sort of have this mystique, this the mystery of ancient religions is a big draw to people. But if you think about it critically, think about what else was the ancient, what was the ancient world actually like?
In what way?
Like, how is it different from today? Like, you think about like the ancient world, you think about these old texts, and they have these sort of talk about things that happened a long time ago, and they fill you with awe and wonder. And it's a common thing, right? And you're going through these rituals that are thousands of years old, and maybe you're surrounded by stained glass and spires and beautiful statuary and perfect lighting and maybe some music, like choir singing, and you get in this sort of altered state when you think this is like there's something that's otherworldly about it. And it's part of this is this idea of reverence for the ancient or for something that's old. But let me just pitch some things to you about the ancient world. No indoor plumbing, no science.
They couldn't really hold up like Clifford's criteria to completely fact check all their evidence because they're very limited on the ability to look for evidence.
So the teachings of all religions emerged in superstitious eras.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So like, what would you, so like mythology, like Greek mythology,
Uh-huh.
it's like, that was a form of philosophy or I guess, religion in a sense.
It was a
right?
religion,
It was
yeah, sure.
Considered a primitive form of religion, at least in today's standards. So what is making that what makes that like a primitive form of religion? Just the fact that we have like moved on over time, or is it just the fact that like
I think
just,
the idea
people
that
just
like
overall just like, oh, there's no evidence to prove that this is true, it's over, just moving on.
well, you can see interestingly, it's part of the reason it's more primitive is because it's old. So we revere things that are old, but not all things that are old.
Right.
And I think like if you look at the evolution of religious ideas, people look back on this and they see like this sort of idea of the gods as being kind of superhuman people, like they're like you and I, but they're immortal, and that they engage in political squabbles and vie for power and supremacy over the earth, and
So they have more effect on the metaphysical world, right? Or the material world, sorry.
it's seen as sort of
Deification.
improbable because it's a primitive understanding of like the spiritual
Yeah.
world.
There
This idea-
seems
yeah.
to have been a global trend from spirits live in everything, advancing to, well, actually, it's just a group of superhuman deities, to actually, there's only one God. So pretty much over time, it was like streamlining, it
Mhm.
seems.
Yeah, so you start out with animism. This idea there's those spirits of gods and everything, and totemism, and sort of the shamanic tradition. This idea you have like a witch doctor or like a tribal shaman, and he deals with the spirits, and he'll put on a scary mask to try to scare them away, and he'll have like a rattle and shake it, and he'll do these magical rituals and invoke the names of the good spirits to drive out the bad spirits. And how do you know if you're like possessed by bad spirits? Well, you're kind of coughing and you got the sniffles, or maybe you're writhing the ground in pain and agony because maybe your appendix is about to burst. So does anybody know what an appendix is? No, so they think it must be a demon that's causing you the pain. And then your appendix bursts and ruptures, and then you're dead because there's no modern medicine. And the shaman can shake his rattle and do all the incantations, and most of the time you get better anyway, or sometimes you die, right? But as long as you get like some cures, you think, oh, this works. It's like the post hoc fallacy, right? It's just that when the sun disappears, right? You have an eclipse like we had not too long ago, and so people see that, and that all of a sudden the sun disappears, and they start sacrificing virgins or whatever, right? They do some ritual, and then the sun comes back. Oh, guess we better do this ritual next time that happens. Yeah.
What's the difference then between that and, like, say, in today's society, people praying for people to not have cancer?
It's a good question, right?
Right.
I suppose one is, like, we have a modern understanding of what cancer is and what disease is.
Right, based off of science.
Based on scientific knowledge.
Yeah.
So we don't think it's demons anymore. So I think it's a step up from saying God can cure physical diseases caused by, scientific, caused by biological means, and then as opposed to thinking all diseases caused by demons.
Okay. Well, yeah. The only reason why I brought that up is because there was a Richard Dawkins did this thing where he went over to, it was in Paris or whatever, and they sent people who were sick every single day to the Roman Catholic Church or whatever, and only 6 out of the thousands of people who ended up going there over this like 10-year period, only 6 people ever got like better, and they were all over like the cold or small minor like illnesses.
Yeah.
And everyone else either passed or continued to be sick.
Yeah.
So just based off of that evidence, I mean, wouldn't you say that to put your faith in scientific method would be a little bit more of a way for people to, I don't know, understand the material?
Well, yeah, the proof's in the pudding. Like, you get a higher cure rate when you go to the hospital than you go to the witch doctor, right? So anyway, just to go on, I like what you said about the development of religion. You have from the sort of animistic type idea, there's localized spirits and everything. You get the spirit of the trees and the spirit of the river, and they're all like very like, it's like the spirit of the Willamette River and the spirit of the well in the tribe's area, and the spirit of the particular mountain ranges, right? And sometimes there's like big spirits like spirit of the sky and so on, but typically it's the local spirits that matter. And there's guardian spirits that protect you, and then there's the spirits of your ancestors, and you ask for their protection. And this, you see this in like all around the world. If you look back far enough, you find traditions like this. And then you get polytheism, which is this idea of many gods, like the Olympian pantheon. If you look in Saudi Arabia, you have the similar thing with this guy named Allah, who's the head of he's the king of the gods, associated with the moon. And he had 3 daughters, and then you have all these other sort of gods and goddesses, and this is the native religion of Arabia before Islam came. It was basically this same sort of polytheistic idea. And a big conflict in the early history of Islam was between the polytheists and the monotheists. The big thing that Muhammad brought was this idea there's only one God. And at the time it was like there were Jews and Christians around, but they were in the minority at the time. And so polytheism is sort of the next step on. You have monotheism, so you got maybe Moses, maybe Akhenaten. Akhenaten was more like, you have this middle step here called like kind of monolatry, which is this idea that there are other gods out there, but my God's like the biggest and baddest God in the block, and you should only worship him. So this is a worship of one God. So you get this idea of sort of like this really big king of the gods, and then maybe some sort of minor spirits and things, and maybe a good god and a bad god, or bad gods who are rivals, who are sort of a pale shadow of the great God. And that's kind of what you get in early Judaism. And then monotheism, but also you get in the East, you get pantheism, this sort of idea that all these different gods are manifestations of the one God. And not only that, but God and reality are sort of interchangeable, and that God is the totality of all existence. So you get animism, polytheism, monotheism, and pantheism sort of coming out of polytheism. So you see this in India. You have the idea there are all these different gods and the three major gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and then there's there's 300 million gods in Hinduism. But gradually they developed this idea that all the gods are manifestations of the one reality. So that's the pantheistic idea. Yeah.
So pantheism kind of goes, well, you're worshiping your God, but he's really my God in disguise.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my God's your God, and your God's my God. And then not only that, but there's no distinction between me and God. We're part of the same reality. And you're God, and I'm God. And I'm you, and you're me. And he is she, and we are all together, goo goo goo, right? This is the Beatles being influenced by Eastern mysticism in the Walrus. So it's this. But you now here's the suspicion part, right? You look at a lot of these books, and maybe they come from this, which is sort of maybe a certain point along the development line. But you see, this wasn't didn't come out of nowhere. It's like a long period of development from these more primitive forms, and the idea of God sort of evolves over time. So why should you sort of see this part and see, well, this is the way, this is the truth, this is the way it is, when it's just the part of this process of long development of ideas. So that might be a reason to be suspicious. And even in the time when monotheism developed, you have people with primitive beliefs about science. Modern sciences come around to the 16th century. Maybe you get something like it with the ancient Greeks, but in maybe the 6th or 5th century BC. But really, you don't get the modern scientific method till, say, Francis Bacon, right? This is around the time of the Renaissance. So all these religions predate the Renaissance by 1,000 years, and you're gonna take this as a guidebook for your life. So this is the question about these are all coming out of cultures which are primitive in lots of other ways. So maybe you'd expect their social, political, and religious ideas to be primitive too. And then the things we talked about, fear of death. There's maybe a longing for justice. An explanation for suffering, which maybe is part of that. These seem to be part of the human condition. So if you're afraid of death, if you want to find a meaning for your suffering, and you long for the evildoers to get their comeuppance, and maybe there's also this idea of internalized guilt. Maybe I'll just put the word guilt here. And you really want relief from these things. And then you can think of a way, you think, well, maybe I should be a little on guard that I'm going to leap into something that gives me all these things that I want, like these deep desires at the bottom of my being where I want to live. I want to know why. I feel bad about myself because I've done something wrong, and there's no way I can shake that feeling.
It also suggests, Nietzsche suggests that it also gives us a way to correlate and decide that we have the ability to know what is true and what is not true. If we understand what's divinely correct and wrong, we know we have a conception of the universe. We have we're not lost in some nihilism anymore. We have he puts it posited that man had a knowledge of absolute values and thus adequate knowledge precisely regarding what is most important. So it gives us way more definition than we really needed to have.
Yeah.
It's just it was a weird answer for nihilism.
Yeah, meaning, hope, right? There's all sorts of things. Maybe value, this word of values comes from. We'll talk about that, I guess, next hour. This question, where do ethics come from? It gives you very convenient answers to all these things that people are looking for answers to and have hope for. So then that might make you a little suspicious of it. Now, this doesn't show doesn't show that it's false just because it gives you these answers, but at least it might make you suspicious. Maybe the reason I believe in this religion that tells me that I can live forever and I believe I have a soul is because deep down inside I'm afraid of dying. And I can't face the thought that someday I will die. And so as a result, I have faith in this idea of the afterlife. I can't face the idea that my suffering is pointless and has no reason. And so I come up with this idea, somebody pitches me the idea that, well, this is all part of God's plan. And I feel better about it, right? I think, okay, and maybe they even show me why suffering is necessary. That God's teaching you a lesson. God says this world is a proving ground where you have to show your faithfulness to God. Oh, okay, that makes sense. And instead of like, why is this happening to me, right? That's a bad place to be. And psychological studies show that when people have a reason why something bad's happened to them, it actually helps them feel better about it. So all these things, people long for some sort of meaning in life, hope for the future, instead of like suffering in a pine box, waiting at the end of this life. There's it's a Chinese proverb. It's maybe it's Japanese. I think it's Japanese. It's man is born crying and cries until he dies. Right, so you think about that as like a metaphor for the human condition, right? You come out of the womb, it's cold, it's shocking, you've come out of the nice, warm, comfortable womb out into the world that's cold and hostile, and you start bawling, and it's pretty much the way it is until you die. That's when the crying stops, and that's a pretty depressing idea. I remember seeing there was this beauty queen. She comes up. This child beauty queen who was like murdered when she was 5 years old, John Benet Ramsey. I remember seeing this Inquirer title. It said, "John Benet is in heaven now," right? I'm like, oh, that's a comforting thought. And instead of John Benet was like garroted in the basement, and now she lies in a pine box being eaten by worms and decomposing. Right, which is like you might like that, and you might see, well, that's like those are the two alternatives, right? This innocent little girl who was murdered and perhaps sexually molested and then murdered, maybe by her own family, that she's just rotting in a pine box and that's all she wrote, and the person that did this is never going to pay for the crime, never going to get caught, right? That can get under your skin, right?
Society just doesn't like the abrasiveness of reality.
Yeah, but it's an excuse for weakness because it gets into the skin to like delude myself and what it actually is.
Okay, well maybe this is a question about whether you should be callous or not. I know Nietzsche's into the callousness, but most normal people, they see like innocent little girl is like raped and murdered, and then and the guy is gonna get away with it, and that's sort of the way the world is. That's depressing. It's much more comforting to think that, oh, this is God allowed it for some reason we don't understand, and her spirit's in heaven now, and she's doing okay, and the assailant someday will be roasting in hell for his crimes, right? And he's going to pay, he's going to get justice, yeah. So this idea is there's no justice in this world, but there can be justice in the next. And maybe there's also the idea that as I, try to do the right thing and toil through this life, that I'll get some reward for my trouble, because so far it seems like that I try to do the right thing and I get punished for it, right? Or maybe nothing happens. And so this idea that good is rewarded and evil punished is a very comforting thought, and maybe should make you a little suspicious about a belief system that pitches this to you, whether you want to believe this because it's comforting as opposed to there being any evidence for it being true. Yeah?
I feel like that kind of ties into, like what you guys said about the callous thing, like thumbs and stuff.
I feel like that ties into the first thing Clifford said, like in the first week, about how if you allow yourself to believe these things based on no evidence, that it's no bueno. So wouldn't painting that picture of, oh, she's in heaven now and everything's okay, isn't that inherently harmful? Like, doesn't that stop us from thinking of practical solutions to a problem of children getting kidnapped, molested, and killed? Like, it stops us from even having a conversation that leans to the direction of, hey, what can we do about it?
It is a softener, right? And maybe you think this, anything that softens the blow of harsh reality maybe keeps people from doing things to prevent it. But then what do you do with things that can't be prevented, right? You've got cancer, you go to the doctor, you go through like 6 months of chemo, and the doctor tells you you're a goner. Then what do you do, right? You see, and he tells you got 3 months to live. A lot of people get religion at that point if they haven't had it before. Most people get it when they find out they get cancer if they didn't have it before, and it helps people deal with it. And the people that, and this goes back to this idea of the practical benefits of religion. Religious people seem better adjusted. They live longer. They have better relationships. They're healthier. Like all markers is an average, but individuals different. But overall, religion seems to actually help people deal with things.
That's why I kind of look at religion as like a benefit from evolution, not necessarily like human thought led to that, but it has evolutionary benefits to us.
Yeah.
But how long will those benefits last, and then what's going to be the other side of that when it stops becoming beneficial?
Immorality.
Yeah, I mean like, just because it leads to a happier life, but maybe when we hit a certain intellectual point, then it'll be like, well, there's no point. This isn't going to benefit.
Yeah, maybe it's you might say at some point, maybe you might argue that it's outlived its usefulness.
Yeah, exactly.
But at least
singularity gets here and we all become quasi-immortal demigods with technology.
and all that happy
escape incoming drones, so.
prediction of the apocalypse. Let's take a 10-minute break.
We're hive-minded or beast, someone's strong enough to control it, and we're still hive-minded, but like not collectively.
Right. I think
All right, last comments on religion.
It's good talk, good talk.
We went to ethics. So I'm trying to break through this idea. People that don't think critically about religion, they think, people will say like feel-good things like, oh, all religions teach the same thing. No, they don't. All there are many roads to God. What's your evidence for that? So all religions are the same? No. Okay, they're different, but they all lead to the same God. Well, why do you think that's true? And then this, and acknowledging the fact that religions teach different things about God and salvation, and they all contradict one another. So either one of them's true or none of them are true. And then what's the maybe some reasons to think that maybe you should be suspicious of religions. They come, just because they're old doesn't mean that they have some sort of, what's the word, extra scientific truth. That they have some alternative way of knowing, or they have some sort of mysterious something that came from the past that we've lost today. It could just be they're old, and there's reasons, maybe psychologically, evolutionarily, why we revere tradition, while we revere the old, why we have that sensation of awe and wonder when coming across things that are very ancient. But those might just be psychological tricks. And if you think about it rationally and logically, these are belief systems that came from a pre-scientific era, and you can find in all the major texts superstitious ideas, folk religion, magic and superstition, and primitive cosmology, and all sorts of things that don't seem to fit in with the modern world. So that might be a reason to be suspicious of these religions as revelations from God. Now you can do like the figurative meaning, but so this is, we talked about this last time about the sort of liberal interpretation. I'll just let this be the last point of the interpretation. So there's one thing to use, think about religions as being not actually true, but maybe as useful metaphors, or things that tell us about the human condition, about human potential, about ethics. And so you have this kind of like a Jungian interpretation. And this is where you look at them as sort of being like fables that tell you about deep things about psychology. And the psychologist Jordan Peterson has popularized this. So he says you can see these stories as being like a way of understanding the human psyche and how people think and conceptualize some things. And so basically you get insights from into psychology and ethics from these stories, but we should junk the metaphysics and the sort of, I don't know, spiritual beliefs. But we can still get something out of these things in terms of understanding the human psyche, human culture, human behavior, and also ethics and what it is to be a good person. And the idea here is you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, religion's a bunch of nonsense. That these religions, although maybe based on some like metaphysical mistakes about this fictitious spiritual world, and Peterson I think still believes in God, so he believes there's a spiritual world, but he sees these revealed religions as being man's attempt to explain God, but as having these deep insights. He's doing this series on the Bible right now you can find on YouTube that's really I think really good. I just saw a thing he did on the Cain and Abel story, comparing Abel to Dylan Klebold, one of the Columbine shooters. And it's a lot of existentialism in there and stuff. It's kind of interesting, but it's a way of seeing these as being no different in kind from, say, Aesop's fable, right? So you get the story of the grasshopper and the ant. So there you have like the grasshopper is just sort of going around and playing and goofing off, and and not storing up food for the winter, and the ant is being industrious and productive and saving food and getting ready for winter. And then winter comes and the grasshopper is freezing and starving to death, and the ant says, you should have been working. And I forget how it ends, but like this. So it's a story about the need to be productive and industrious. Now, does that rely on there being an actual ant and an actual grasshopper that the story really transpired? Does it, the tortoise and the hare, does it matter that there actually never was a race between a tortoise and a hare?
They made it happen. Someone set up a race between a tortoise and a hare, and the tortoise beat him because the rabbit was goofing off.
There you go. Maybe you could like mix the stories into some new hybrid story. Yeah. So that I mean but you should be conscious of the fact that you're no longer taking these stories as they were intended by the people that wrote them. So one thing to consider is that all like the literary and historical evidence is that people who wrote these stories believed what they wrote, and they weren't intending it as a metaphor or as sort of like just stories. That people really believe this stuff. This is thousands of years ago. Like I said, there's no indoor plumbing, right? There's no dentists. Most people are illiterate, right? People believe there's a demon behind every rock. So they're not going to come up with this sort of sophisticated story and see things in sort of these abstract, metaphorical terms the way people see things today. They're going to see these stories as being literal and real. So that's something to consider. It's a liberal interpretation, meaning reject the literal meaning, the intended meaning.
Do you think religion could have been a beginning of philosophical thought, and religion was a way of trying to solidify those thoughts, like parables, for instance, from the Bible? Like, those are decent guidelines to go by, and they're good stories to try and prove a more moral sense, a better moral compass. So, I mean, do you think religion might have been the start of humanity trying to produce philosophy without, like, the idea of what the reality of the world is?
Maybe. I mean, they had forms of philosophy before religion, didn't they?
Shamanism.
Yeah, I like Plato.
But
Yeah.
like even before, like in the beginning, before they even had like lots of words and languages, I mean like cause and effect, like this stick isn't going to move unless something moves the stick. Like I move the stick, but the trees are moving, and all this is moving. There's water coming out of the sky, and like so something has to cause that, because like nothing here is going to move unless something causes it to do it. So like what's causing this to move? And there must be like a hand behind the stick.
Yeah.
And I can see that leading into like.
And then just trying to justify like why they can do that and why they would do that.
That's why I think women got deified for a while, because like they got tired of watching the harsh nature. Like people are dying. There's like a lot of thunderstorms that might kill you. You might die from the cold. You don't know why. Like your pancreas is exploding. So like they can't stop death. But here they have women who are like actively bringing in new forms of life, which almost seems to be like anti-dietic and kind of deifies them, because they're the only ones who can like fight back this unknown.
Yeah.
And this is like the personification of nature. This is like a sort of alternate explanation for like how religion gets started. And like you can see like gorillas, and when there's a big thunderstorm, the gorillas will display war behavior, like they're going to go against another tribe of gorillas. And so they like beat their chests and growl at the sky to try to scare away the evil thing that's making all those noises and the scary flashes of light, right? So that's this idea of thinking about a hostile force, which is, we now is just electrical discharges, and, basically like the same thing that happens when you're, doing this on the carpet and touching your friend, right? And getting a static discharge. It's just clouds of water vapor moving against each other, and there's a big static discharge, a really big one, right? So and then, people used to think, well, that's Zeus hurling down thunderbolts from Mount Olympus because he's pissed off at somebody. And it's like, oh, what do we do? Well, we'll sacrifice an animal. who doesn't love the smell of barbecue, right? And so religion is our idea of the angry gods and trying to placate the angry gods through sacrifice. It gets started, it gets more sophisticated, and as society changes, the gods change with it.
Rick and Morty represents it so well with the large heads, the singing one.
Oh,
Yeah.
Show me what you got.
But see, I feel like if that hypothesis is true, that we have a tendency to personify nature, like anthropomorphizing is like an inherent trait, and of course, like that'd be why like religion went to the form it did. We're just anthropomorphizing all of these like imaginary values.
Yeah, so these sort of like angry gods, and this sort of idea of sacrifice. And then what do? Well, maybe you want to butter them up, right? So you like tell them how great they are, right? So you get these odes to the gods, and you know these religious texts that celebrate how great they are to get the gods on your side. And then maybe there's like gods are seen like spirits. Some are good, some are bad, some are kind of in between. So you want to get the good side gods on your side through sacrifice and praise, and then scare away the bad gods through invoking the names of the good gods. And you get this idea of basically bribing the guys that you want to help you, and then getting them to help you against the guys that are not being helpful. And then there's this sort of idea of magic and incantations. It's sort of a part of that, trying to manipulate nature through ritualistic behavior. So that's the other kind of component of religion. And you see this in the cave paintings, even in France, with like the Cro-Magnon man cave paintings, where they're not just drawing on the wall just like for fun. The idea is that they thought that there's magical power in kind of ritually recounting the hunt and giving them sort of magic juju to succeed in the next hunt. That's what most anthropologists think. Anyway, so that's all these things ought to make you a little bit suspicious of, well, okay, this is kind of how primitive religion gets started, and then it seems like primitive religion evolves into more complex forms of religion. But all of a sudden, like you think, well, but in 2000 BC, God spoke to Abraham, right? And that's the real religion. That's when real religion started. All this other stuff is superstition, but God spoke to Abraham, and then there's like the Exodus, and even though like all the stories of Exodus looks like it's cribbed from the Babylonians who came before them, and the story of the flood looks like it was also borrowed from the Babylonians. You can kind of see and they got it from the Sumerians. You can kind of see the relationship between these religions and how they evolved over time. And again, it seems irrational to say, well, everybody else's religion, that's just superstition. I was talking with Ahmed about during the break about everybody thinks that other people's religions are silly, right? So the idea that you have like I think of some, I'm picking anybody, Scientology, right? So then you got spaceships and Xenu and all this sort of alien and spaceships. You're like, that's weird, or Louis Farrakhan with the mothership or whatever. Like that's crazy. But the idea of towers reach into heaven, and a fruit that gives you the knowledge of good and evil, and another one that lets you live forever, and talking snakes, and all this stuff is because it's normalized to our culture, it seems plausible because lots of people believe it. But we should be aware of those things. Like, be aware of the fact that you're more likely to believe ideas that predominate in your own culture, and those ideas look as bizarre to people from other cultures as yours might look to them. Yeah.
So you said earlier in class that when I asked like your distinction between cult and religion, it was time, and like you said the time to like cultivate religion and culturally get it together, right? So how does that work for Scientology if that is a new religion to our society, right? How does Scientology differentiate? Because it didn't take that much time to like get started, Yet so many people in like LA believe it.
I feel like that's a big topic. It's maybe a little afield of here. I'd say like maybe the idea is that you should be suspicious of a religion that it was started by a science fiction author that has lots of science fiction-y things. So this guy writes.
The guy wrote more.
He writes like
more
science
pages
fiction
than any
stories.
other author.
Yeah.
Once, two. One draft, like
One draft.
One
And
draft,
then,
like just,
check
just
it.
banged it all out. Like, I'm journaling here, you guys.
So maybe I'll just leave that off because there's a. I mean, maybe I'd say, and this is characteristic of like modern religious movements. They tend to be started by an identifiable, charismatic figure, and we tend to have lots of information about them because it's in the modern age, and because of that, you're able to sort of dig up reasons why that person might not be reliable.
I just find it interesting that, like, in the United States, that we have freedom of religion, and we have yet the most denominations of Christianity in the United States, and we have, you know, Scientology starting up, and like all these different, you know, religions,
Yeah.
you know, kind of getting their foundation here. And I was just thinking of like the development of religion over time, right? And so with science kind of, you know, being more influential in our society, I guess, do you think that religion over time will, you know, continue to go down that path and have, you know, certain smaller denominations and like...
Well, I think it'll have more like...
People will be more like, have their own, I guess, secular way of thinking.
It seems that people are becoming more and more secular, and the more like technologically developed a country gets, the more secular they become. America's kind of like late to the game, maybe, and it's because of our Puritan heritage. Because a lot of people left Europe because of religious persecution. Right. See, basically, the people that came here were highly religious, more than the usual population, and it is imbued into our culture. And so it's one of the reasons why America is, you know, the most, I would say, like the most technologically and advanced country on the planet, and also the most economically advanced, and also the most, you know, militarily the strongest, and culturally like the biggest producer of mass culture. And so like this, you know, America's on the top of the heap, but also very religious, but maybe. Yeah,
world, like you said. So
very
like,
influential, but then the also very religious, but I think becoming less so, and the reason is just because of our heritage. And so I would guess that, I mean, the trends looks like America's going the way of Western Europe, and I think new religions like Scientology, they use scientific symbols. What's that?
In Western United States or Eastern United States?
Well, I was just talking about the U.S. in general. I was talking about Western Europe is maybe distinct from like Estonia or something like that. Although they're an up-and-coming country, but you know, Western Europe, like Spain,
I would say
France,
the culture
Germany.
of the United States is very different. I'm from Oklahoma, and I would say that Oregon is completely different from Oklahoma. Everyone there is very like religious.
Very religious, right? Yeah.
Like, I'm an atheist, and if I had said that to someone who was in Oklahoma, they would probably shoot me on the spot.
Yeah,
Also,
I got jumped.
I'm not like that. That wasn't an
Really?
That was a serious thing. Like, it's not an exaggeration. Like, people don't. Like,
also,
I don't know. I find that
so it's like-
Western
Imagine
United, the United States is a lot less, or in what you're describing as the liberal interpretation of religion. But I don't see that on the eastern side as much.
Also in Oklahoma,
And so-
everyone's all Trump and MAGA and this and that.
It's very
Well, it's the Midwest. Yeah, it tends to be more. religious.
I see it in a different way. I guess I don't really see the liberal interpretation getting as big in the United States.
You look statistically, people,
Yeah,
urbanites tend to, we're becoming increasingly
Can I
urban
just make my own religion?
society. What's that?
Federally, like just fill out like
Yes, technically you could.
501c and just be like, this is the religion of me.
Okay, I feel like this conversation is fragmenting. I
It's
just want
honestly
to,
impressive.
I want to stick with this idea of,
That's awesome though.
like secularization. So like the long-term trend is America's becoming more secular. So even though maybe people in Oklahoma are still highly religious, overall, like the average of America, the number of people that would describe themselves as secular is larger, and younger people they're more likely to describe themselves as secular. Also more conservative, interestingly, and talking about the MAGA hats and everything.
It's interesting, like the older people get, it seems the percent rises that people start believing in gods. Like, isn't it true that like a majority of older people believe in God compared to younger people?
I think that's because
I've heard
the
this.
older people were raised at a time when belief in God was more prevalent, and
Fair
the
enough,
beliefs,
yeah.
the beliefs, religious beliefs tend to be sticky. People tend to hold on to them.
Fair enough, yeah.
And so that, I mean, that's a big part of it. Also, people tend to go back to the religion of their youth when they have kids. So if they are going to go back to it, typically like middle age, they'll like, they got sent to Catholic school and they hated it, and then they left the church, and then or they like never came back to church, except for they have kids, and suddenly, or maybe they get married and they want to have a Catholic wedding, and then, or they want to send their kids to school, and they're like, well, send them to Catholic school, good morality. Let's talk about morality. So,
Yeah, their thought is
So
it's
it's-
probably like, well, it benefited me in the long run because I was
yeah,
more
even though
of a
they
good
hated it and
person.
they saw it as like a horrible experience,
Yeah.
they think it'll be good for their kids. So.
To jump back a little bit though,
I know some people have good
also
experiences.
removes responsibility from people. It like shifts the burden of duty to the all-powerful being. Like, I almost don't have a responsibility to save starving children because God wanted the starving children.
Oh, that's
That's a good
maybe
point.
another thing. Let me just before we get to ethics. This is the last thing, sort of.
It's like hope. Hope is negative in my opinion because like you hope that somehow the universe will make something happen
Yeah.
for you that you should be actively going to get done yourself. Like it's your responsibility to get what you need versus like hoping that some random circumstance is gonna bring like this thing.
It's
into
like
your
sitting
life.
back and just expecting things to
Yeah,
occur.
which may never happen, and like you just.
I would say, yeah, that's definitely the weak side to religion, is the hope aspect, absolutely.
Now I think
I mean, that's also a really strong, powering thing too.
Yeah, though it
So it's
is.
hard.
But
now
we
some
should-
people say that like moral standards that come from religion actually hold people responsible.
Yeah.
So
So that's the evolutionary benefit, I think. Because, I mean, if you have a standard that all these crimes are bad, but somebody's watching you all the time,
Yeah.
it's going to make people be more safe to others, kind.
But is hope like a byproduct of the lack of confidence?
I would say so,
Because,
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
It should be okay to destroy the need for hope if we just gave you the confidence to achieve what you think should like come to you. So like
Lack of intellect as well, I think.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that people that believe in religion are stupid. I wouldn't say that. I just think there's some questions out there that are very difficult to answer.
Yeah.
Very difficult. And that's where I think hope comes in, because we don't have the willpower or the ability to solve them.
Wouldn't that be
yet.
more faith?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be more faith than hope?
And hate.
Yeah.
Because
and faith
you're,
as well. Yeah.
you're kind of making a jump, like
Yeah.
faith of, you're
Trying to solve something with the idea.
Yeah, leap of faith.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah,
that's the best way to put it.
all right, let's move on to ethics. I want to make sure we talk about this today. So
I'd say maybe that's a crutch. That's a crutch until you can reach a certain.
Well, I mean, if you don't
Yeah.
have that faith, then you're not a real true believer.
What about ethics?
oh, let's talk about ethics. So. Now, I think where I want to start with this. So, you're thinking critically about ethics. There's like two things that sort of people will talk about. So there's ethics. So there's culture, and then there's like sort of conscience. Or maybe, I'll just say individual belief. And then there's maybe something like subjective feelings. Maybe this might be different. And then maybe there's something like personal matters of personal taste. I'm just mentioning all these things are sort of seem it's part of where our attitudes about things that people call right and wrong, good and evil, good and bad, just and unjust.
Is ethics the same thing as morals?
Yeah, I'll just say ethics and morality. We'll just treat
Okay,
these as
I'm just making
synonymous.
sure.
So when we say something's right or wrong, does that have to do with our culture? Does that have to do with our individual feelings or beliefs? E-L-I-E-F. Is it just the expression of subjective feeling or personal taste, or are all these things different from ethics?
Well, I mean, if like individual belief like comes together to create the cultural belief.
Okay, but the question is there anything to ethics beyond those individual beliefs or collective beliefs? Yeah, I guess it's.
I think culture is the biggest thing of it, because, you know, go back 200-300 years, slavery was totally normal. Not a lot of people spoke against it. Now, 99% of people will tell you that it was a terrible thing.
Right.
And it's no longer, well, for the most part, it's no longer a legal practice in the majority of the world.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you know, so I think culture is a big thing. Go 200 years from now, when we talk about today, there's probably something we're doing that's going to be considered very barbaric, like unfair prison system or things like that.
So then there's the question of like the cultural standards and whether like cultural mores, but is that the same as, you know, ethical truth? Like, if morality and culture are the same thing, we'd say, well, slavery was okay back then, but it's just wrong now. But then the question is like, why judge people in the 19th century by modern standards, say? Now,
I mean, could you say that throughout like human evolution, we've just been building a tower of morals, and just slowly but surely we're just constantly editing that tower?
Yes.
Yeah, creating just a stronger base every, you know.
and then what is it? What are we
Yeah.
building though? Like that, and that's a different idea. That this idea of moral evolution.
Yeah.
That moral
And moral
evolution.
evolution, that's good.
So this is sort of this idea that you know.
Well, I mean, religion seems to aim for immortality, and like ethics almost seems like if there's going to be any kind of consistent ethics, it would be like something that doesn't change, it's not a part of flux, so it would also have to be absolute.
Yeah.
In each religion. teaches
So it looks
their
like we're trying to find immortality, whether through a conception, an understanding, or through physically being it. So it sounds like ethics, maybe at the very least, is like about survival and progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like you could make an argument that like values are based on this idea of at least like the things that human beings need to survive. It seems like that what we call right and wrong and the rules of morality have like a survival advantage. There's a question about whether those are all, you know, necessarily, whether that's all it is. Like, is it just sort of evolved behavior traits?
It's almost like an adaptation.
I would say yeah. I'd say yeah, because you know, if you're killing a lot of people like we were back in the olden days, you're gonna be weakening humanity to an aspect, but also you're gonna be killing the weak.
Yeah,
So I mean,
that's
there's all. I
survival
mean,
of the
as
fittest.
awful as that is, there is an evolutionary benefit to that. So it's like, when did society change over to the idea that like keeping that genetic influence is okay, and that's where I think religion changed that. So I mean, whether that's a positive or negative thing, I don't know.
So genocide is okay as long as you're killing out the right people? Is
I mean,
that
like,
sort of the
Nazis, I
idea?
believe in
I
Yeah.
disagree with that. It'd be more benefit for our survival to let even the genetic mistakes thrive, because you never know where that can lead. You know, the first polar bear, the white fur was a complete accident, but then it thrived in where
That
the
could be
snow would
used as
go.
a bad thing, but it turned
Yeah, and then there's people with autism that
Adaptations.
changed industries.
Yeah.
Out of the cattle industry in the 80s, you know, I think it'd be really wrong to just be like, oh, not good enough, snuffed out. Like, by what standards?
I'm so tempted.
Yeah.
I'm so tempted to bring up our discussion of the abortion display here on campus earlier in this conference.
Right.
But I'm not gonna go there. Yeah.
To go along with the cattle thing, and like for like artificial selection and stuff, we've for like thousands of years have influenced the world and like manipulated the earth around us to benefit us. So it's not necessarily things that like we think, or not necessarily that like reality thinks, or not reality thinks that these things that are these adaptations are negatively affecting us. they're our own personal feeling. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're like negatively affecting like the polar bears. Like the white fur was a great adaptation that allowed them to survive and flourish in that area. So these adaptations to like religion and like modifications, they were like the gap theory, like with science,
Yeah.
and other, you know, nonsense stuff. But like, I think the evolutionary idea, I guess like that's where I was trying to go with the secular thinking, is that are we moving to a more like secular religion thinking where we each will all have kind of like our own individual ideas of what we perceive as religion?
I think to answer, or try to answer your question, I have to answer the question, it'd be the question of segregation. If we're not gonna like disinclude like this is bad or that is bad, then like if it's positive or it could be beneficial, maybe we need to put it into an environment where it will be beneficial. We need to give it its like, we gotta find its environment that it could prosper.
Right.
And that's
But what dictates that's beneficial?
how well the being prospers. So you just put them in different, at the very least we have to begin putting them in different environments and seeing which one they did worse or which they did better. And I guess we have to deal that based off how they felt, how they acted, their mental states.
Maybe that's what stopped us, is we don't have the understanding of what is beneficial and what isn't, and so we stopped making the decision ourselves and let nature do its course. And maybe that's why we have a better understanding of how genetics work, how it works, and so instead of just killing off all these people, killing a bunch of people, we decided, well, let's see what happens.
Because especially within Mesoamerica, I know this with the Aztec religion, human sacrifice, stuff like that. These were all things that were based off of environmental conditions in the area, right? And so, like, I guess, like in my eyes, like artificial selection and those certain like aspects, manipulating the world to our benefit, kind of goes along with religion in the sense that we've turned the material world to our benefit to necessarily get to that, you know, heaven or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's let me just take it back maybe to the material world. Let's talk about like evolutionary biology.
Because like we've noticed signs of domestication in early Mesoamerica. This is like 6,000 years ago, and we've definitely progressed since then.
Sure.
In religion, so I just like I guess like my eyes, I see the environmental aspect of influencing religion in that way, and that's how we've kind of progressed as a society culturally. And I don't think necessarily we'll ever have an absolute morality. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think
Constantly
morality, I think in my opinion, morality is whatever benefits us as a species or as us as an individual, right? So I think it's hard for us to really dictate what
Well,
is
what if those things are different?
morally correct or not. Huh?
What if those things are different? Like I could do what's good for the species, or maybe I could do what's good for me. Supposing those things diverge, how do I decide
It
which to
depends
go
on what
with?
scale you're putting morality at.
Like you know,
What do you mean?
and like it might be better for the species if people are going around stealing other people's stuff. But I have an opportunity to steal something, and I'm not going to get caught.
Right.
It's like, you know, so like, what do I do?
I guess that's my point. I don't think that there is really a true like,
That's one thing I
moral.
Well, I'm just saying, like,
Tough
let's
part.
assume we agree that it would be wrong to steal.
It's just
Then the
something
question
that
is, should I or
benefits the
shouldn't I?
individual, you know what I mean?
What's that?
I think it's just, I don't think there's really a true moral. I think it's just whatever benefits the individual.
No,
That's what makes.
All right, let's just cut the side chatter here for a second. But see, that contradicts this idea of morality as being sort of this growing body of knowledge that tells us how to live in the world and how to be successful as a species. And then you're like, oh, it's just look out for number one. Those are like contrary ideas, right?
Can't you use those ideas from other people and the evolutionary progression of ethics and use that to your own interpretation?
Like to screw other people to get what I want, you mean?
Yeah.
Like you're going to
Is that really what ethics is?
No, but I would assume, I
think that's- yeah.
wouldn't put it past someone in the world to do that.
That's
Well,
an
I mean,
interesting
people are
Throw
choice.
that hypothetical.
people act that way, right? But I'm
Right.
just saying, like, there's a distinction between, like, it seems like there's a distinction between, like doing what's good for me and like being an ethical person, right? Being like okay.
But what dictates that being ethical? That's what I'm saying. Wouldn't it be whatever benefits that the individual or group?
Well, think
So,
about
like-
it this way. Neil kind of posed the question, though, like, if you were to do something, you'd have to question, like, if everybody did what I'm about to do, what would the world be like? And
Right.
then would I want to live in that world?
Right.
So it's not so much like, is it like, it's beneficial for me and it would work, and like, everybody could do this, but like, it might not be sustainable. No, so like, just because it's right for you doesn't mean it to be sustainable for everybody. So it's like doing what is right for you that doesn't negatively impact somebody else at the very least, but that still doesn't give you any kind of sense of criteria.
Well, why should I care if it impacts anybody else unless they're gonna like get revenge on me? What if they're not powerful enough to do it? Okay, think of recycling, right? Recycling is a pain in the ass. You know, you get my little yellow bucket and get, put the cans in there, and they take some stuff. You know, what is this number 3? Did they tag that or not? They left it the last time. You know, and like, people say, well, it's, you know, the environment. I'm like, yeah, so, and well, it's, you know, think about posterity. Think about how you're leaving the planet. I'm like, well, what's posterity ever done for me, right? Why do I waste all this time recycling? Well, it's this idea that I should care about like people in the future, and I should care about the environment. It's not always in my interest, right? It's like, would I rather not spend time, you know, hauling out my recycling the curb? It'd be easier just to throw it in the trash. By the time, if there is a long-term impact of like the garbage piling up or whatever, it's like, I'll be long gone. Why should I care? And so this idea of morality is this idea you should care about posterity, even if you're not going to be around. You should care about future generations and the way you leave the planet.
That's why I think religion is important now, because if you think about it, if you had an entire world that understood that reality has no true meaning, I don't think we would last very long.
Why?
I don't
We've
know,
never
man.
lived in a society where that was true.
Because
Fair.
religion is pretty nice.
So how would we ever know that would?
But I mean, if people thought, you know, if I do anything, it really doesn't matter. I could do anything. Like I feel like that could just lead to. It would have more potential to lead to something.
Right.
Well, I mean, of course, initially, like something like that, if we came across like a global law where like we're not going to punish you, no, there's no higher authority, like it's just all mano a mano. Of course, in the beginning, people are going to let loose and there's be anarchy, and a lot of people are going to die. But at some point in time, it's going to get to a point of fear and respect again, in which case that would wane out. And of course, it'd be a cycle. It'd probably come back and go forth again as people build larger casts, and then finally people are motivated enough to like, I want to destroy them because they're like, I hate them. They're a
And you
threat
have
to my
kingdoms,
life.
and then you're starting over.
But see, then you don't want something so volatile that it ends the human race.
Yeah, and there, like, I guess, like, you think about a religion, like, its effect, like, are people really worried, like, I don't know, do people, it'd be interesting to look at, like, I don't know, people in prison to see whether they were worried that God was going to punish them, or they're just, like, not engaging in long-term thinking or something like that.
Well, as most people in prison believe that like they were supposed to go to prison for some reason.
Okay, so that's not
Like they try to be
fact
when they're there.
realization.
It's like they have to accept the fact that like God put me here for a reason, and then, like they
think that's
They
just-
don't
So that,
exactly
so that
become
might
I mean,
go counter to your narrative that,
Or is that
that the
the fact
reason,
that
like,
they're
if
in there,
nobody
they
believed in
just
God,
accept
then,
it so that they can feel better about themselves while they're
yeah,
there.
it's a way to.
I feel like it's more of a way to cope with the
Yeah.
situation than it is them actually believing that they did it.
but you would expect, like, if religion is this big pillar of morality that's holding society together, you
Yeah.
would expect people
You're
that break social laws and end up being, you know, caught or are like less religious than the general population. It seems like they actually might be more religious, so,
Another internal affair, the majority of people in there are religious. Like I
Yeah.
have so many problems being an atheist.
yeah,
Like,
so that might be it is a good question about whether religion is sort of a necessary pillar or support for ethics. Let's just talk about evolutionary biology for a second, though. I want to,
Yes.
in the last 5 minutes, kinship ties. So what is this? You see this in human beings as sort of this animal. You can find animal morality. So you find, like, amongst troops of chimpanzees, there are chimpanzees that are helpful, that'll like groom other chimpanzees. There's ones that will not groom another chimp, or there's some chimps that will groom another chimp if the other chimp grooms them. So you might think about them as being like the egoists, altruists, and then sort of like people that are engaged in reciprocity or something. And the chimps that engage in reciprocity are the most successful. They do the best. They get the most social support.
And which one was that again?
The ones that will groom if somebody else grooms them. So this sort of idea of exchange. And the kinship ties has to do with this idea of like family. So you care about your children, right? And you want to perpetuate your genes. It's evolution. And so then the question is, what happens when you have this sort of, this is all instinctual, right? That the mother protects its young with great ferocity. It wants to have as many offspring as possible. It wants them to succeed. Why? Because it's perpetuating their genes, because that's sort of what life tries to do. It tries to make more of itself and multiply itself. And it's instinctual, this need to reproduce and to live and to survive and prosper. Now, all these things are instinctual and part of our evolutionary history. So what happens when you get an animal that has like a big brain that can conceive of the future, that can think of abstract concepts? Well, this all gets sort of abstracted as human beings develop. And so you get this sort of idea of, so you get the family, maybe the extended family, right? And this goes to this idea of the tribe. It's not just, it's just not me and my nuclear family or my extended family. I'm part of this larger group, right? So human beings live in these small clans, and I suppose maybe we have the clan is smaller, right? So you get the clan, live in a cave, maybe mostly extended family, a couple of extended families, and then you get like sort of a large-scale tribe, maybe several hundred people, several thousand, nomadic, moving around. But there's this idea where a tribe, we have our customs, we have our traditions, and I think about myself as a member of this tribe. I have an ethnicity now, right? It's not just my family or my clan. Now we're still like related by blood, but also there's this idea of the customs and traditions that allow me to be successful. And then this goes further, and you develop into this sort of idea of a nation, right? And this idea that I am an American, right? And maybe there's a bunch of steps in between, sort of like I'm a member of this city-state, and I'm a member of this sort of region or a country, say.
Categorization. But it seems like it would follow that soon. It'd be like we come to a species. Like it just seems to get larger and larger to the point where we have to include everybody.
And then you have this current movement, this sort of globalist movement, that I'm a member of the human family.
That has to spread, wouldn't it? It'd have to do the opposite. It's growing and encompassing everybody, but then it's got to bring people up. Like.
Well, I think that the idea of ethics is like every human being, I have an obligation to someone, no matter what country they're from, no matter what their race or their creed. Yeah, this is the sort of idea that I have obligations to other people, that I should care about the welfare of other human beings. And some people even include non-human animals. That's sort of, and the idea is this is an abstracted form of these kinship ties that I want to take care of. Okay, I want to take care of my young. And so you have this, and this becomes this generalized idea of taking care of the defenseless and the weak. Now, it makes sense of the family group, but because we have these big brains, it gets abstracted and impressed to the tribe or to the nation or to all human beings through this sort of process of abstraction and argument by analogy, if you like. Yeah.
Well, that was just a random question. Like some sort of otter. Like the otters, what they do is they'll only eat 1 to 3 items, even though there's like 20 things that they can eat. But only select groups eat select parts. Is that a form of like ethics in a way? They're like, hey, let's share everything to make sure everyone has enough of everything, and we don't affect things too much around here. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's an evolved trait of like limiting consumption in order to further the welfare of the group. There's all sorts of group dynamics that are built in, And these are things, these are hardwired in us. Like we have these things called mirror neurons that allow us to respond to the emotions of other people directly just by reading their expression. And so, and this is all part of like our moral reactions as well. So we'll talk more about this on